again, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Srikanth Mangalam. He is now going to be going up one more level. So we started with an organization, for example, a healthcare service provider like a hospital. And then we started talking after that on to supply chains. And now we are going to go one more level up and talk about a much higher level of aggregation and especially societal and the implications of technology on policy and the global perspective. And that presentation will be given by Mr. Srikanth Mangalam. He is the founder and president of PRISM, which is Public Risk Management Institute. He's an internationally recognized expert in risk and outcome focused decision making in areas of social impact and sustainable development, with over 25 years of experience in North America, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Europe. He's considered as a visionary and a thought leader, and has pioneered innovative solutions to addressing complex socio-economic and sustainability challenges in a variety of verticals, including public safety, food security, gender equity, climate, health, youth employment, small-scale trade, and so on. So with that, Srikanth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raj. And I'll just put up my presentation. Are you all able to see the screen? Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks again, Raj, and certainly it's a huge honor and pleasure to participate and present my views on what I'm very a topic that I'm very passionate about and feel very strong.
We see the slide on the speaker mode rather than a slide slow mode. Did you want it in the speaker mode with the notes at the bottom and so on, or do you want it in the slideshow?
I thought I did this last speed. Let me try it again. Okay. Is that better?
It's still back in the same.
Still the same?
Still the same, Srikanth.
I have no idea what.
Presenter view is what it is on.
Let me try this. Still the same?
It's not come back yet. Let me give it a minute.
Apologies. Let me try this again.
Yes, much better, Srikanth. This works.
So I apologies for this. Clearly, I'm no technology expert, as you can see, compared to the other two speakers. So thanks once again. As I mentioned, it's an honor and pleasure to be speaking to you. My affiliation with IIT and IIT Madras in particular is just limited to the fact that my father is an IIT alumni. And I used to hang out a lot with classmates of mine who went to IIT Madras and spent many hours in the campus. And most recently, I've had the pleasure of starting to work with Professor Rajagopalan himself, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that work. And as Raj mentioned, I am going to be talking about societal, or what I'm calling as systemic risks, that span across multiple verticals and multiple areas, but with a very specific focus on issues that affect socioeconomic impact of people around the world, and in particular people in the developing parts of the world. The tendency is that this is a fairly very quickly about the institute that I set up 5 years back. I set it up as a not-for-profit research and advisory with a very specific focus on public good, and work across multiple verticals. We are a multidisciplinary consortium, partners with many academic institutions across very different fields. And I'll get to the point as to why it's important to look at collaborating with the various different fields. And Dr. Madhav rightfully mentioned at the end of his presentation of what he termed as empathy and collaboration, which is absolutely essential as we start looking at these cross-societal systemic risks that I'm talking about. And we've done work in various parts of the world. Some of the work that we have done has been published, and I've just put some of the relevant work, and a lot of my presentation sort of picks on findings and learnings from various projects and research activities that we've been undertaking over the last 5 years. And one of the challenges with looking at risks at a societal or systemic level is they're extremely complex. As you can imagine, you're looking across multiple systems, you're looking across multiple verticals, you're looking at multiple expectations and objectives of society, everything from job creation to safe food, to safe drinking water, to clean air and climate, and the risks that impact them, pretty complex. And as it gets complex and as it gets higher, there unfortunately tends to be lesser attention. It ends up becoming a government problem, which is typically how these systemic risks are seen. And you know as well as I do, as much as there are really smart people in government, that is not enough in terms of solving some of these issues. What I want to share through this presentation is less so about my learnings and my knowledge, which is quite limited, compared to a lot of the experts in the field and certainly the presenters today, but to more importantly share the opportunities that exist for younger people to play an active role in this space. That there are problems to be solved, there are real problems to be solved. And that this is the right time, especially in a post-pandemic environment. This is the right time for young, smart minds to step in and look at these broader societal risks, particularly with the nature technologies evolving. And we've heard two amazing talks before this, which tell you the value that technology can bring in. That's the first point, is just to consider and explore the opportunities. And again, a lot of very wise words by Dr. Madhav at the end of his slide in terms of what you can expect. And this is not all of it will be in paying you huge dividends, but certainly will give you a lot of satisfaction in terms of your contribution. The second part is to I think, which is again a fundamental human challenge and issue, and again, Dr. XQ brought up a lot of these aspects, is the need for the humility to be able to cooperate and collaborate across different spheres, across different people with various levels of intellect and knowledge and capacity. That in order to solve these systemic risk issues, that we have to think in a collaborative sense, and a lot of our work is focused exactly on that, is to try and bring people across different spectrums together and address some fundamental problems. So the opportunity is there, but the approach has to be a lot more humbler and more collaborative in nature. So what I will try and touch upon today, and again, this is just starting the surface of the work that is being done by a lot of very scholarly people around the world, and I can certainly make references to some useful work that's being done. I'll talk briefly about what we mean by interconnected societal, and I'm calling it systemic risks. I'm sure people in the systems field will have a heart attack in terms of how I'm defining this, but so be it. And I'm calling it systemic risk for a specific reason, and how and why do they manifest? And a lot of these are related back to issues of trust and human interactions. And as much as it was important to understand in Dr. Eskew's context about the trust between human and systems, I think we still have a long ways to go to build trust between humans. And that's the part that I'll touch upon is how and why they manifest. How do we respond? Can we solve these problems? And absolutely, the answer is yes. I think there are ways where we can collectively address some of these challenges. And third part is in the interest of the specific organization and the lab that many of you are involved in, and given the importance of data and data analytics. Again, going back to Dr. Madhav's speech, how can data analytics play a much larger, more ethical and responsible role in this space? A lot of you would have taken courses in risk, have seen various definitions of risk, and this is just one such definition. I'm presenting this more in the context of what it means from a societal perspective. So there is this term hazard, which is really an intrinsic or man-made scenario or potentially damaging event that can damage significant amounts of, cause harm to significant amounts of people and their welfare. This could be anything from a catastrophic nuclear accident to a release of a highly dangerous virus, and to an event such as the one that we saw in the US, where a black man was beaten to death by the police. That's again a damaging event that can cause impact on people and welfare. So there's a range of hazards that can occur. And the other parameter that's of importance and significance in this context is how vulnerable we are to be able to deal with these hazards, and the collective functions of actions. And actions can be political, can be economic, can be technical, and our behaviors in terms of individual and collective behaviors, to the extent to which we are capable and resilient. And resilience is an important word here, that we as a collective, in terms of our socioeconomic systems, are able to handle these, and how susceptible we are to these hazards. And risk is simply a function of the two. That's the probability of the harmful consequences that result in the interactions between hazards and vulnerable entities. So keeping that sort of definition in mind, let's see what systemic risks are. And the way it's being defined by Ian Golden, who's a professor and scholar and the director of Oxford Martin Institute at the University of Oxford. He's written some amazing books in this space, and I would certainly encourage people interested in this field to look up Ian Golden and read some of his books. He talks about systemic risk as the probability of breakdowns in an entire system, as opposed to a breakdown in individual parts and components. So this is where you may over a period of time have breakdowns in individual parts and components, but there's a threshold point at which the entire system essentially collapses. And the systemic risks become more virulent or more widespread, especially when the number of linkages grow. And I don't have to, say much more than what we are seeing with the pandemic, and we've heard and we've witnessed and we've seen the issues of systemic risk. Again, in this context, the manifestation of these risks end up in shocks. It can be a single point event, a macro shock, such as a nuclear disaster. Can be network shocks. What we are seeing in the pandemic can happen with infrastructure shocks. We had a massive electrical transmission failure that occurred in North America a few years back, but can also be common shocks that occur. And the example of the death of the black person is an example where you can have these common shocks that occur periodically that lead to cascading or domino effects, and sometimes irreversible effects. That the systems that have gone so bad that the trust amongst people, for example, has gone to such an effect that can cause irreversible damage. And an example of an irreversible damage in our context today is for example, our mental health as a classic example that we might end up in situations where we get affected in various different ways. One of the biggest challenges, if not the single most biggest issue with the systemic risks, is they're extremely difficult to model, particularly from a cause-effect standpoint. Simply because you don't understand the relationships that well. So the moment it becomes difficult to model a cause effect in such cases, we tend to avoid taking on these problems, which is what ends up happening in the real life, is that we tend to focus on simpler, easier problems and become more siloed in our approaches. There's various examples of what the consequence of these system shocks are. The World Economic Forum produces an annual report called the Global Risk Support, and then of course this is when they gather a bunch of experts across multiple spheres and ask them about what the risks are and the consequences are at the global level. And as you can see, we're not short of problems in this world, and almost all, if not all of them, are interconnected. That one can trigger a response on the other. Some of the examples of systemic risks, again, Ian Golden talks, very extensively on this, and we've heard Dr. Madhav mention some of the examples here. Supply chain is clearly a classic example of risk, and I'll talk about one problem that we are currently engaged in with IIT Madras, incidentally, and another problem on food. Infrastructure risks, whether it's to do with energy or transportation or digital, can be perfect examples of where systemic risks can manifest. I'm calling something called anthropological risks, which really deals with issues around cultural, social, gender, and migration-related aspects. This is very much the human-to-human interaction, and some of the systemic risks that exist as a result of lack of trust, lack of acknowledgement and recognition of the differences that we have in our values and the way we practice those values. And all of them become significant factors with respect to systemic risks. The next category is economic, whether it's to do with business and trade, whether it's to do with the state of employment and the state of finance. It can manifest themselves at micro and macro levels in any society. And the final one, which is probably the next big event that we're talking about, climate, as I referred to, is the next big dramatic event that's basically manifesting over a period of time. It's ecological, whether we talk about climate and the environment, wildlife and marine, and the interrelationships between them. Why do these systemic risks manifest? Again, I'm talking about very high level attributes. And as I said, it's very difficult to actually pinpoint root causes in many of these cases, because there's invariably, in most of the circumstances, it's the indirect effects that lead to systemic risks. It may not be direct causes that might be leading to systemic risks, but indirect effects. But what I can talk about are some of the broad sort of factors that influence the quick progress and manifestation of systemic risks. One is with respect to governance gaps and failures. And what do I mean by governance? Governance really, in this context, I'm talking about the understanding of who the players on a system. So in a supply chain, as Dr. Madhav mentioned, that the fact that you need to know, who are all the participants in a supply chain system, and these participants may be direct suppliers, might be direct contributors to the supply chain, may be indirect. So you have to understand who the players are in the system, what their responsibilities are, and how are they accountable to, and how are they handling their accountabilities and responsibilities. We have moral, we have legal, we have ethical responsibilities, no matter what sector we work in, and how are we handling those responsibilities, and how are we holding ourselves and holding others accountable. And so there are large governance gaps and failures. And if you could think about the pandemic as an example, it was a classic governance failure problem. If anyone who tells me that this was a completely surprising event that happened that came as a complete surprise, I would just tell them to take a hike, because this was expecting to happen. There've been experts who've talked about this. There've been significant systemic issues and governance gaps, and the fact that we tended to ignore those has led to where we are today. And again, as I mentioned, and there's larger uncertainties in interconnected risks because they're disproportionate in the way they manifest. There's not the same level of evidence that we have to be able to model and understand certain risks, so larger uncertainties. So when there are larger uncertainties, we tend to avoid making decisions or tend to delay making decisions. And that becomes a big issue. And as a result of that, what ends up happening is we have a disproportionate focus on sort of silo-based issues. So we deal with the parts and not the whole. And we deal with different parts in the system and try and fix problems in parts of the system, ignoring the fact that we need to look at the system as a whole in terms of an integrated approach. The fourth is as a result of that, could be as a result of governance gaps, could be as a result of where we're focusing, could be as a result of uncertainties, and there tends to be an erosion of trust and reliability in systems and processes. And this could be erosion in technology, trust in technology, trust in human behaviors, trust in political systems, trust in institutional processes, whatever the case might be. And finally, something that is absolutely real and something that we are witnessing today is that there may be misalignment of political and societal values or their motivations. And that can go a long way in impacting how systemic risk manifests. So just as an example, how societies have reacted to issues like lockdowns, how our politicians and governments dealt with issues like lockdowns, has yielded different results in today's world. Right? So that's another important factor to keep in mind. So some of the questions, certainly for people in this space to start considering is how do we, in such a complex, difficult environment, how do we model these risks and more importantly, the disparate consequences? The one part that I didn't mention is invariably, if you take the case of almost all the major systemic failures that have occurred, the people who have borne the consequences are the ones who are the most vulnerable. Right? There is not a single case and example that you can think of where the consequences are not borne by the most vulnerable. Whether it's people who are living under poverty, the people who are older, it's women, it's young children. No matter what you do, the systemic failures end up affecting those that are requiring the support the most, which is where the government is supposed to play a significant role. So how do we model these interconnected risks? First of all, in terms of understanding the complexity, but accepting and acknowledging that there are disparate consequences as a result. How do you account for the diversity and range of evidence that happens? We don't have the same level of understanding and technology that exists to be able to tell us where problems happen and views and perception to risk. Are we actually measuring the most appropriate outcomes of our actions and interventions? Do we really care about what's the most important in our case, and how do we deal with sometimes conflicting outcomes? Is it as important for us to have a job today, or as it is to protect ourselves from health consequences? And how do we deal with those conflicting outcomes that might be obvious in some cases? And finally, are our actions and interventions, are they integrated? Are they fair? Are they proportionate? Are they equitable, consistent, effective? A lot of these value-based attributes. So how do we respond? I think some of these responses might seem conceptual, might seem soft, but I think there's no other option. I think the first sort of approach, and I'll try and very quickly talk about at least one example in the time I have. There are four, at least at a minimum, four areas of work that we need to do. And well, firstly, we have to have a shared purpose and ethical values. If you talk of a food system, do we understand and accept what are our expectations from a food system? We want nutritious food that's available. We want food that is safe. We want food that is accessible at any point we need. So these are shared purposes and values that we have with respect to a particular food system, that they serve a certain purpose in the public context. So do we know those? And so can we look at this across multiple systems? The second part is to try and help achieve those purposes and values, that we build a governance capacity and infrastructure that are coordinated and cooperative, that are resilient and able to respond to changing needs and risks. So just again, going back as an example, when we had the SARS crisis in 2002, I believe, 2001, 2002, the WHO came out with a regulation in 2003. I think it was called I'm trying to remember the name. Anyway, it was an incredible piece of legislation that the WHO came out with in terms of how we could deal with pandemics in a manner that looks at it collectively and cooperatively. So they essentially established or recommended a systemic governance structure, and almost all countries around the world endorsed that regulation in 2003. 2004, everybody forgot. No one actually went back and changed their jurisdictional systems to align with the WHO regulations. So we need to go back to those. We need to use those institutions like the WHO to create governance systems that actually help us solve these problems together. We need to start making better use of data. I mean, and the application of data should primarily be focused on building trust. And in fact, what's happening right now is a lot of the data is eroding trust amongst people. So we have to shift that focus and say, how do we start using data in a smart, open, transparent way that people are able to trust and believe in and realize that it's in their best interest. If data has been collected from the public, it has to be made available to the public. The public has to take ownership of it and decide how that data gets used. Right? We're completely going the other direction with respect to the utilization of data. And we should start thinking about interventions that are proportionate to risk, focus more on where issues are and co-create them. So people start feeling that they're part of the solution and that they're building resilient systems. Sort of a lot of aspirational things here, but as I mentioned, that's exactly what we need to do. And that's the space we are in. We're trying in a very small way, creating a collaborative platform where we can bring all aspects of any system together and look at risks in a collective manner and can co-create intervention. So that was the motivation and objective behind setting up this institute, and that's what we're progressing towards. So a little bit of a marketing spiel here, but that's of interest to us. So I'll talk about, given the time, I'll at least spend a little bit of time on my first case. There are several cases that we're working in. I'll talk about small trade in Congo, a project that we just finished the first phase earlier this year, and an interesting work that we started with youth unemployment in India, but we believe there's a global context. And third is looking at cold chain vulnerabilities in Zambia. There's a project that certainly a part of it that we're engaged with Dr. Raj and his team. So we were called into this project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, really asking, the ask was, there are small traders who operate at this border between Congo and Zambia. They're taking a long time to be able to transact and undertake their small business. Can you help us solve that problem of reducing the time that it takes for them? Right? I mean, that was basically the ask. It was simply, the bureaucracy is too much at the border. Can you help reduce the bureaucracy? And the moment we went in, we realized it wasn't as simple as just changing a few rules and a few methods. That we're really talking about improving conditions for trade at the border. Just to give a perspective of what we're talking about here. So this border exists in the region between Zambia and Congo. Most of these countries are importing countries, so a majority of critical essential products are imported from other parts of the world. And Congo has a particular problem that they're dependent on their neighbor for these products to come in. So goods arrive from Zambia and South Africa and other countries through this border and enter into the Congo. So for a variety of reasons, and I won't get into it, a lot of these goods end up being unloaded in a market on the Zambian side. So just a picture of the conditions that are where products are being traded. And these goods can include fresh produce, consumer products, frozen foods, electronics, furniture. You can think of in some cases medicines as well. So you can think of literally everything. The last count, I believe, simply at this border alone, they trade to the amount of $200 million every year. So it's a massive transactions. So what happens is approximately about 5,000 traders walk across or take these bicycles, which I'll show you, from Congo into the market. They really function in really poor sanitary conditions. They have to go through a massive manual complex process for registering, for getting visas, and you can see the lineups there, right? And I took this picture when I was there last March. They have this pedestrian corridor. They walk across, they purchase goods, pay a whole range of fees. As last count, I think there were 4 or 5 different types of fees that they pay. And even the authorities, the monitoring of who are the people walking in, whether they have the right papers, are they bringing the right products, are they trading illegal products, are they paying customs, etc. All of that is manual monitoring intervention. And I can tell you this is a pretty common sight in sub-Saharan Africa. They use these modified bicycles to carry these extraordinary loads of goods, right? So you can look at that. I saw, in one instance, I saw 40 big screen televisions put on my bicycle and taken across. So they load them on the Zambian side, transfer them onto vehicles on the other side, and off they go. So what are the issues here? And when we started going through really what the issues are, one, there are major governance issues. There are the political considerations, legal considerations. So why do these traders even exist? And when we started dissecting, we realized that the custom duties were so high for trucks to go across to Congo that it was absolutely, it made no sense for them to take those goods across. So all they did was unload them on the Zambian side. And there's a strange rule that exists in that part of the region where if you are trading under $2,000, you don't have to pay customs. So what these traders would do multiple trips in a day and get back $2,000 of goods and then do these trips. So they basically found loopholes in the system and played around with the system. There are institutional issues. There was absolutely complete lack of trust between government bodies and the traders and the people. There are huge socio-economic problems. And as you can imagine, all of these is entirely informal labor. So there's absolutely no labor rights, huge issues around gender equity. Women felt very unsafe, but ended up being some of the most significant parts of people, percentage of people who do this trade. And they had challenges in market access. So for example, when the entire world shut down and there was lockdowns, the very livelihoods and essential products were cut off for these people. So what they did was they basically created their own pathways across to Zambia. They broke the customs. They rioted and went across, because for them the daily eggs and food was more important than worrying about a coronavirus, which at that point didn't exist. And remember, this is a region where Ebola was huge. So again, the market access became difficult. And I don't even want to start about the human health and safety issues in that region. And finally, one of the issues that became significant is the safety and integrity of products that were being traded, simply because of the way it's being traded. So talk of cold chain, right? Frozen fish would come to the Zambian market well protected. And these guys who take it over on bicycles, there's nothing frozen. There's no more frozen cold chain there, right? They put it in these styrofoam boxes as though they protect the cold chain. They go across the border, the fish would rot in the markets for a day or two, and people would buy it and fall sick, right? So talk of cold chain failures. This is basic cold chain failures. So we started, as you can imagine, we tried to model this problem and we tried to get an understanding. Clearly, it's an extremely difficult issue. We tried to make a simplistic cause-effect model in this case, and came up with a whole range of factors that influenced the variety of risks. Our model, as much as we focused a lot of this on building a risk assessment model, really what we were aiming to do is create a more collaborative approach to solving. So our first main important part is to build trust amongst them. So we spent a lot of time understanding what each issues, and I was in an absolutely incredibly heated meeting that you had army officials sitting in the room along with small scale traders, right, and customs authorities. So the whole approach was building trust, building capacity, getting all of them to understand risk in basic concepts and how it is important to solve these problems, etc. And to make the entire exercise exciting, propose some really cool technology solutions that we're hoping the next phase will get implemented. So, some of the immediate responses were collectively. This is the important part, is that we co-created the solutions. We came up with solutions to address governance issues. So we produced a report that everybody signed off and said, yeah, we want this, and we will ask the government to produce this. So we co-created solutions. We put forward some smart, simple technology solutions, digital identification of traders, even start mobile payments. Phones are so prevalent there. Why should people trade with cash, etc.? And look at some product traceability solutions across the board, and made some recommendations on improving infrastructure and human capacity. So this is I just provided a very sort of broad background on that case. How are we doing on time, Raj? Can I go one more case? Okay. So quickly, a second case. This is another interesting project. A cousin of mine runs a very successful NGO in Mumbai, where they're trying to bridge the last mile between young adults in school all the way to employment. So they've realized in that region and lots of other parts of the country that young adults tend to fall off the system and don't end up getting jobs. And so they're working in that space to try and address that last mile gap. And during our conversations, she brought up many underlying issues that were leading to these challenges. And what we wanted to do is assess and look at what factors are affecting youth unemployment, and especially this takes place in vulnerable and at-risk communities. And we think this is fairly common in many parts of the world. So the current approaches that talk of silo-based approaches, current approaches to solving employability problem is strictly through this force-fitting solutions of skilling, right? Why aren't people unemployable? Oh, because they're not capable, they don't have the right skills, they're not educated. So let's just pour money into skilling and skilling development and education, etc. Completely ignoring what the barriers are, understanding what the barriers are, what are the contributing factors, and even when they recognize it, really not focusing on designing interventions. Whereas the communities are desperately asking for those. They're telling the policymakers and decision makers, look, it's not as much the fact that I don't have a mechanism to go and attend a class. I have other issues that are preventing me from going and attending class and getting the skills. So even at the macro level, this interventions are very silo-based, and they don't look at these interconnected factors. So some of these systemic risks in this context, poverty, there's a lot of research that's done. We've actually just sent a paper on this subject, hoping to have it published this year. We looked at issues like poverty levels, household incomes increase. The fact that the household incomes might be low forces some of these youth into getting informal employment. So we saw this horrific case of young children rack picking from one of the largest dumps in India, in one of the regions in Mumbai, and they were subject to absolutely horrible health and safety conditions. But they made money, right? They made money in that context and brought back an income because the household income was low. Food insecurity, the access to food can reduce growth in the labor force. This is proven. Proven that certain agency and cultural factors can reduce women participation in the labor market. A simple thing like access to drinking water. At what time does the tanker come? If the tanker comes at 11 o'clock, it has to be a woman who has to go and collect water. If it comes at 11, that woman cannot go to a school to attend classes. So some of these are forced on the system. So access to drinking water becomes an issue. Energy insecurity, whether they have cooking gas at home, can affect their ability to access education, even impact their health outcomes. Using more gobar gas, using more biogas in indoor settings can cause health hazards. Infrastructure, we found, we ran this exercise with some young adults and asked them to basically do a risk assessment and come back to us and say, what are your issues? And they said, well, in one case they said, we don't have a bus stop in our community. And that makes us have to walk long distances. So when they petition to the local council and say, we need a bus stop in that community to be able to access. So simple solutions can come through just understanding what the risks are. So infrastructure can play a big role. So what we are trying to approach this is through a community-centric approach. Can we create an integrated risk platform? We're creating a back-end model where we can leverage some of the beliefs and experiences that exist in those communities, even though there is no lack of data and evidence. And how can we leverage some of the beliefs and experiences? So we build sort of Bayesian approach to modeling these risks, trying to facilitate the co-creation of community-owned interventions, and hopefully this will lead to better informing external stakeholders, whether it's government institutions or investors and donors, so that they put money in the right place and get the right results. So we have a model that we're working on. I'll quickly go through. The last case is the work that we've just begun. This is looking at supply chain failures that are affecting the integrity of medicines that are important to Sub-Saharan Africa. There is very little literature in this, but there are anecdotal evidence that suggests that almost 35 to 40% of products are compromised by the time they reach the border, or once they reach the border and get into the market. With essentially a lot of them being cold chain related. And you're talking about vaccines and antibiotics and now insulin, which is becoming a key medicine in that part of the world. And we've identified limitations with governance, with institutional and technical infrastructure, a whole range of aspects that are leading to negative health effects, and you're seeing consumer complaints to the point where in Zambia it became a huge political uproar that a minister had to be fired for a product that failed in the market. So our approach, this is very exciting. Where we're working with Dr. Raj and his team to really do a risk assessment to identify what the systemic vulnerabilities and weak points are, which is the first step. And then in parallel, we're starting to look at building a collaborative framework that would lead to a whole range of interventions, ranging from what can we do from a policy standpoint, how can we engage the private sector a lot more in solving this issue, and how can we start looking at technology solutions that can address the risks in the supply chain. So second last slide, data can play a massive role. The fact that you can physically observe things significantly reduces uncertainty in risk assessments. You can monitor transactions across systems and that reduce time and cost. And again, Dr. Mala spent a lot of time presenting that. I think from our standpoint, it generates evidence, if rightfully used, can ensure transparency and build trust and improve efficiencies in the system. So the fact that you have to have the right governance framework, somebody talked about regulation. Regulation is a good idea in terms of a prerequisite when you're applying technology. So my summary is that systemic risks are real and increasing, and they're leading to disproportionate consequences. We simply cannot ignore it and be in denial. And it requires humility and multidisciplinary efforts to really understand and manage these risks. There's a huge opportunity and potential in the way we use technology that can be focused on alleviating challenges and building trust. I love the iPhone, but almost 90% of the features on an iPhone are irrelevant in the context of the issues around public good. Trusted institutions, academia can play a massive role in building partnerships. I was so glad to hear about the lab that Dr. Raj has set up, because that's focusing on applied science. That's getting into the space that institutions like academia should start playing in building partnerships and solving these problems. Local initiatives are absolutely critical because they complement macro level governance and that help create resilient systems. So top down is good, but really a bottom up will provide the foundation for systems to be resilient. I think that's it. So right now our collaborators are across the world, across multidisciplines, and we're hoping that it can grow as we start doing more work. I haven't put IIT MEN yet, Raj, but I'll do so shortly. So thank you. And I think I crossed my time. I apologize for that, but I wanted to get some messages across.
Thank you, Srikanth. That was a wonderful presentation that really touched on a number of things that I think are close to the hearts for all of us. We see it around us day to day, but we don't necessarily associate it with the science, the technology, the math that we deal with during our work day. So it's fascinating that you're able to kind of bring them together and demonstrate that it's really possible to make a impact on what's sometimes called the bottom of the pyramid. So I'm sure we have a number of questions. Let me start off with one question which was running across my mind. This was from a conversation that just happened a couple of days ago. Somebody told me that there is this thing called the experimentalist paradox, and then there's something called the analyst paradox. And the point they were making is that the experimentalist paradox is where when an experiment is conducted, people believe the outcome of the experiment when it is done on some real system. Almost everyone except the person who is conducting the experiment, which is the experimentalist. Now, when you talk about analyst, there is this analyst paradox where you use a computer model or whatever. Nobody believes the model or the outcomes except the guy who developed the model. So, do you see this kind of a paradox at all in your line of work? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Absolutely, right? Absolutely, because and if I understand the two paradoxes correctly, I think it's the perception, the view from which you take, right? So who's receiving the output, right? Unfortunately, because the recipient of any of these decisions or processes aren't considered in the process, you end up in these situations. So you end up in experimental paradox, as you call it, analyst paradox. And so in my mind, the fact that you're not considering the people in the bottom of the pyramid as part of your solution, as part of co-creating the solution, you're constantly imposing things on them, you are going to fail, right? So if I feel that I have, even as a charity foundation, I have money and I want to, I believe in the fact that skilling is the solution to education, I'm going to put money because I know that's that's what I believe in. But whereas the person at the receiving side is screaming at you, saying, "Well, this is not where I want your money. I need it somewhere else." Right? That's exactly. And modeling is the exact point. And modeling, there's the other challenge with the analysts is that we tend to simplify our models because we don't have evidence, and we use the fact that we don't have evidence to sort of create these assumptions in the model, and those assumptions mean nothing in real life, right? So, and again, if you had a conversation with the person who's receiving it, they would provide you evidence that you would have never possibly considered, but they would have provided a gold mine of evidence, right? We talk about cause effect, just speaking to people and understanding what's affecting them will provide you more evidence than any sort of national monitoring system. So that's the other issue is how much of the interaction that happens in terms of whether it's an analyst or experimentalist between the solution creators and the receivers of the solution, right? And that's a gap that's missing. It's that this notion of co-creation doesn't seem to happen more often than we think it needs to happen, because we tend to live in hierarchical societies, right? We've never, when we sit in a table, it's very rare that we actually consider everybody at the table as an equal, right? I mean, that's human nature, right? We somehow want to feel superior in some way to the other. So systems are created that way. Systems are created hierarchically as opposed to an equal trust. So to your question, I don't know whether I answered the question, but that's more common than you think that those issues happen. So.
Great. So let me take up a couple of questions from the Q&A. So Mr. Bridge Mohan asked about your case study number 2, and he was wondering if you had some results that you could share in terms of employment issues before and after implementation.
We're not there yet. We're not there where we haven't solved the problem yet in any small manner. We are the more than us, the NGO is starting to see some changes. I'd referred to the organization is called Antarang Foundation. They have a website. They actually produce some results. So they're starting to see some changes and results. I would certainly urge people to look up them. But with respect to looking at the interconnected risk problem, we're not there yet in terms of solving it. So.
Okay. There's a question from Mr. Mubarak Ali, and he says, what are the emerging systemic risks in the 21st century for science, technology, and innovation policy?
I mean, I think apart from a lot of the issues that have been brought up by Dr. Eskew and Dr. Madhav, I would just advocate the issue of trust, right? I think the erosion of trust in systems and processes is probably the most significant systemic risk that exists. And it affects all aspects, whether it's a man-machine, whether it's human-machine or human-human interactions. I would consider trust as probably the number one systemic risk, or the lack of it. So,
great. Thank you, Srikanth. That was a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll probably stop here. So again, thank you for
very much.
Great insight.